I don't know whether I should speak English or Italian, probably more English so that I think more of you can understand me, actually. Okay, I'm from Officine Zero. Sorry, couldn't welcome you before all here, so I'm very happy to have all of you and especially to meet all these new experiences and all these workers' initiatives that are around Europe. Also because I think it's very important not only to connect and know each other is the, let's say, prior step also to being able to network and to at least get as many people and as much as possible these experiences to be known. I'm part of Officine Zero, as I was saying, and maybe it needs a little more explanation because, as you can probably notice, I am not a typical train maintenance worker. But as I, let's say, longly explained also whilst we were touring around the area and the factory, a bit about the experience that brought to the occupation of this train maintenance site. Originally, let's say, this is one of the areas that encloses lots of contradictions at once. On one side, the privatization of public services, the night train service, and more than anything, the train service shifting to certain, let's say, choices, made also a shift in certain types of work very strong. This was a whole area where there were many workers of the public sector previously, that then was progressively privatized and then progressively laid off. Also, it's let's say one of the last. It almost looks like a relic in some moments of the production sites that are so, let's say, central in the city. If you go further out in this area, more towards the outskirts, there are more. But let's say, very slowly, there was a very, recently especially, there was a very strong change and strong shift in the type of use that, and the type of work that is in the area. Most of it was converted slowly from public service workers or maintenance jobs in this area, especially into office blocks and other small-scale building residential apartments also. So it's an area that is changing very rapidly. Also in the composition of the workforce and of the people who work around the area, there's high juvenile unemployment and a high level of precarization of work. What happened in Officine Zero initially was a struggle that was, as I told previously, was a defensive struggle. A struggle that was meant when the company declared bankruptcy to try to keep the nature of the place as a maintenance site and as a service of public utility. So originally the workers' collective, who was here and of which part still stays here working, wanted a re-employment in the public service. This was the first demand. And it was a demand that met a lot of support also in the nearby networks that it opened to and that, let's say, supported the workers' struggle. This unfortunately was not possible, and then progressively, let's say, became possible for some of the workers who actually got transitionally re-employed with worse contracts than the ones they had before within the public service. What happened when we decided to occupy the factory after the last company had declared bankruptcy was quite interesting, because the workers' struggle basically opened up to the, let's say, solidarity networks, but also it interchanged a lot with other struggles of precarious workers and groups that had been laid off from other sectors. communication sector, precarious workers from that had either small individual jobs or were working for other firms and had lost their jobs, so they had been, let's say, coalescing to try to protest and find an answer. When finally the public sector declared also that there was no response for a possibility of, let's say, converting this sector to another type of maintenance, many assemblies were done with the previous workers' collective, with some of the new workers and support network collectives, with student collectives that were in the support network also, and it was decided that the occupation would go on. And it would have been an occupation that would have had its central issue in continuity of labor, or giving instruments or possibilities for people to continue making a living out of the use of the space and the use of the machinery. This brought us to the creation of a mixed collective, precarious workers and some of the previous workers, and now we actually are doing we barely manage to cut a living. We, unfortunately, on these conditions, let's say it's a survival level. But we are managing, let's say, to bring forth an initiative by which we are trying to put together different levels of production, craft work and let's say more informal and communication scale. I would like to try to, now that I've, let's say, briefly illustrated the experience, I would like to try to go in depth with some of the issues that we were speaking about before, and also some of the questions that were in the panel. I think there is, let's say, great continuity of our story, also with a lot of experiences of direct recuperation that we see around. Also because we see how, let's say, all these recuperation experiences have to and necessarily have to network with the nearby communities and have to put up our perspective of relationship with an open processes to be able to survive. Also, let's say what we have created here is something that is somehow similar to what, let's say, is happening often in cases of workers' recuperation. We have a collective assembly of workers who decides every time what type of jobs are prior to make a living or to manage to cut an edge. We have assemblies for planning, let's say, the different workshops, and then group assemblies to try to plan as much work in common so that we can then make a share out of it. And we try to share competences so that we can empower, let's say, each other's competences. For example, our previous worker from the tapestry has publicity from people working in the co-working, and we agree on like strategies to be able to try to put these elements together and make the jobs as one. It's an open process. It's an open process to the workers' community, and it's a process that needs, first of all, a strong form of self-regulation. So workers' assemblies are fundamental in this case. First part of the, let's say, self-regulation is that workers, even when they can bring in their individual work, don't compete one against the other. And they don't, let's say, lower tariffs or possibilities to have a better opportunity to get jobs, but they come together and try to plan as much as possible of the work they would normally bring here in common, so to have better opportunities. One other aspect is, let's say, the networking and the mapping of the nearby services and needs of the community that we are trying to bring forth. One part of, let's say, reinforcement we're trying to bring through is that of trying to get, let's say, the use declared of the area as public utility. This is not an easy process. It is a process that in this phase, when even public assets are being violently privatized, it is very difficult, as you can imagine, trying even on a, let's say, workers' initiative base to, in name of the defense of labor and the possibility of producing new forms of income for the workers of the area, getting an area to be declared public use, especially when it's private and facing bankruptcy, is not an easy process, but it's something we're trying to do. Also, because the place will be auctioned, it has already been through an auction, and the, let's say, limitations on the use of the area that are being put through have actually made it more difficult for it to sell. We would, as it was said though often, many of these attempts are somehow defensive, and it is very difficult to come out of a defensive form. There are many key issues around this. On one side, I must say, it is also interesting to compare to other experiences. In our case, especially at the beginning, the role of, let's say, also the relationship with the union was, the traditional trade union was a very difficult one. Trade unions are not inclined to supporting self-management in any case, unless, for example, though I did less than the encouraging case that we hear in France, where some very brave delegates of the CGT are actually deciding in some cases to support the initiative, and in this case have a very important role in negotiation in this role. But they are let's say, some cases that I think also our closer experiences should look to, especially when they see how these make a difference sometimes in the possibility for success. Another issue, what has happened here, for example, is that new forms of unionism or new forms of, let's say, grassroots unionism helped new workers to come in here to sustain the initiative rather than the traditional trade union. And I think this should also make us think about the possibilities that slowly, let's say, that the workers have also in having to put forth new, with the reinforcement. It's not as sometimes before it was said, the cooperative form or the non-cooperative form, the defense of work or the cooperative is a form. The point is whether from there you can manage to negotiate better conditions, or if there is the will to be able to negotiate better conditions. In the Italian case, also because one of the questions of the panel was forms of recuperation and of workers' co-ops and access to finance. In Italy there is a law that was created, I think, in 1985. It was the Marcora law, and it was a law that is meant to facilitate workers' buyouts. So when a company goes bankrupt, there are actually financial instruments, let's say, for cooperatives to be able to access the buyback of the company, taking part of responsibility of the previous ownership's debts to then, let's say, develop their own company. It's has had some success, especially in the 90s, and recently it has strongly declined as a process. But it hasn't created exactly many occasions in which there has been, let's say, elevation of the condition of the workers. So this is something we have to look at carefully. There are, I think, some cases also of recuperation in this sense that are similar to what we could call recuperation, but they are difficult to find. They are difficult to network. They sometimes have interesting relationship with surrounding communities, but they don't, let's say, create an offensive political strategy. It's difficult to even often get information about them. And also because, and I think this is an important point to make, because one of the, for example, key points that was really strong in the Argentinian experience, for example, was that of not only the capacity of the workers to create a movement, but also to create networks and to create a strong force of negotiation towards the state that went, let's say, further than the singular situation. So this for let's say processes of also empowerment. I would like to add another, let's say, small consideration on processes we are, let's say, entailed in and undergoing now within the city of Rome. There are two experiments that I think are interesting on our side that have been put through recently. On one side, there is, let's say, almost more of an outcome of the work that we are doing in here, outside and within the city. We have sort of started to relate to many situations of small co-working spaces or groups of precarious workers that before were either working more individually, and now we're actually putting up project plans and supporting groups and networks that are trying to build up, let's say, a broader platform in the city to give opportunities to very precarious workers to build up better job opportunities and also better job negotiations. And this is a very interesting process, I think, that is being put forth now, because it actually workers, let's say, come together and try to think of what kind of jobs and production processes to put together according to the competences they have, and how they can try to make their working conditions better through projecting work in this way. And let's say this, the experience of Officine has been also quite successful in trying to bet on a process like this, and it's having its first small results. Another thing is the let's say natural link we found with all the let's say battles for what is now coming together as what we call the Right for the City movement. It's basically now, as also was said before, we are facing a phase of very strong and violent privatization of services at all levels. And it's interesting that next to, let's say, an open process of defense of public assets or of public space, there are now also many groups of workers, not only from the public sector, or groups of parents, for example, of kindergartens, that are coming together collectively to, let's say, defend not to defend the public, but to open a discussion on how many of the public services should be run, or how their work can, let's say, actively be used in different ways. It's very interesting, for example, the work that the water committees after the water referendums have been doing in this specific case. Is some of the workers from Acea not only are, let's say, fighting against the privatization of the service, but some of them are actually actively putting up small committees for when the water service is interrupted, to, let's say, illegally put it back to how it was. So people are getting water hooked up again, also thanks to the workers that are, let's say, disobeying to what their company is telling them to do. There are small examples that are not self-management, but are like hints to what and how the workers in certain services question also the way they work. So I think that the link and the direct link between these kind of initiatives and the network that they can create is fundamental. One last thing that I think could be useful is at maybe more European level, etc. We were saying that very often there is, let's say, this. Now there is all this talk about the public-private ownership and the running of the public services, etc. What we're trying to say to local administrations, regarding the initiatives we have put up, obviously we have a huge problem, which is property. We need a title to be able to negotiate certain conditions of work. But what we're trying to say to the public sector now is that, to the institutions more than to the public sector, is that if they can finance banks, if they can have, let's say, money to put towards initiatives of enterprises that are supposed to create development and working, but then can do more or less what they want with it, they should try to put more funds and European funding directly into encouraging these experiences that point at grassroots processes, because these processes are strong, in which they are very resistant. They are more resistant than capital enterprises that very often enter places, send them bankrupt, and after 2 years close them down and leave them like this. This place drained after its last buyout, drained something like 7 million euros from the banks that were never returned, and left public service costing something like 2 million costs in water and electricity. And this was the last buyout that failed the company, and the administration that failed the company, and laid off its workers. So we feel easy and comfortable in saying that putting money and assets and finance into experiences like this is probably and the best safe way hand they can have in doing so.
Thank you so much.